Can you explain what you refer to in your theory as the cycling forces?
Yeah, the first step in defining these two forces was to first define gravitation, because from that definition, the parallel force for what happens to consciousness would present itself. Unfortunately, the reality was that gravitation was and still is considered by science as a force not completely understood or defined beyond Einstein's gravitational lensing of light, Newton's mass attracts mass, gravitational effect on orbiting planets. So I had to do my own research to seek out a more complete definition. And what I recognized in this search was that mass attracts mass to form stars, where mass energy is burned in fusion reactions. And when these different sized stellar bodies reach a point when their reactions can no longer take place, they implode or explode to create all the elements in the periodic table and various types of stars, such as pulsars, neutron stars, black holes, etc. In other words, mass transitions through a series of compressions into a spectrum of increasing densities.
Did that information help you to define gravitation?
Well, what became apparent from this research was that gravitation is a cyclical force. And I define it this way. So if I can remember this. Gravitation transitions from a relatively weak force in the new universe, cycling mass from a widely dispersed, uniform, lightest, highest energy element, hydrogen, through a series of compressions in stars over the duration of the universe, into a relatively strong force in the densest form of matter, black holes, a uniform, minimal energy element which can combine, eventually contracting all mass into a single entity black hole by the conclusion of the Big Crunch. By relatively weak or strong, I mean in relation to the secondary forces, which we'll get to.
The idea of a big crunch, though, that's not new, right?
Right, that's right. However, the definition of gravitation is new, this one that I'm presenting.
So, by compression of mass to denser forms, starting as simply as mass attracting mass to form stars, is that what Einstein meant by out of simplicity arises complexity?
That's exactly it. That's one of the things I talked about earlier, is that one of the philosophic premises of the theory was out of simplicity arises complexity. And here you have the simplicity at the beginning of the new universe of mass attracting mass, and that initiates forming of stars and all the progression that leads to the full spectrum of different elements in the periodic table, the different types of stars and black holes, which are very important, as we'll see later.
Did that new understanding help to define what I presume would be the parallel cycling forces for consciousness?
Yes, I realized this definition of gravitation, its parallel force, would in a similar manner compress consciousness. And I refer to this cycle as Conscilution, a term I coined, a combination of the words consciousness and evolution, meaning individual consciousness evolution. Whereas mass compresses by way of stars, consciousness compresses by way of infusing into life forms, using them to elevate through a series of graduated thought levels back to the God level.
And how do you define that?
Conscilution transitions from a relatively weak force in the new universe, cycling consciousness from a widely dispersed uniform, lowest level minimal energy consciousness through a series of thought level compressions via life forms over the duration of the universe into a relatively strong force in the highest form of consciousness, a God, a uniform highest peaked thought level which can combine, eventually contracting all consciousness into a single entity God by the conclusion of the Big Crunch. So what you can see is you can see that both of them are widely dispersed, and there's this cyclical force of gravitation and conscilution compressing mass and consciousness back to a point where they're in the most compressed state, overlapped, predisposed for the next Big Bang.
Is there a shorter layman's version of the cycling forces?
You could state it as the compression of mass and mass to greater densities and consciousness to higher thought levels, eventuating as single overlapped entities. Now, as you can surmise from the full definitions, black holes can combine just as gods can combine. And from this depiction, you can see that at the conclusion of the Big Crunch, these two cycling forces are complete. Both compressed single entities overlap, predisposed for the next Big Bang.
Do these two definitions attempt to explain the forces at work to cause an eventual Big Crunch?
No, they simply define the two cycling forces. The forces that work to contract the universe into a big crunch involves universe shape and density, and is something that will need to be derived from astronomical observation.
Well, you described mass and consciousness as having a differential expression of energy. What is meant by that?
Sure, as mass and consciousness expand into a new universe, although both forms of substance are in their most expanded form, they're differentially expressed, meaning mass is at peaked energy and consciousness is at minimal energy. I use the minus symbol to indicate minimal energy and a plus sign, as we'll see later, for peaked energy. When they're eventually compressed into overlapping single entities, their energy states have reversed, with mass at minimal and consciousness at peaked energy. This differential energy expression, though, that's what facilitates an infinite flow of energy from Big Bang to Big Crunch, universe after universe. Now, let me just show you something with some triangles here.
Okay.
Now, this is just a depiction. This is not the shape of the universe. Let's move this out of the way. That's not erasing very well, is it? But I'll do it here. But if you were to, let's see, we'll use that for mass and we'll use this for consciousness. And if they actually disperse out together, but I'm just doing it this way so you can see that if we have a bunch of consciousness and we have a bunch of mass, and they're widely dispersed, and then through these two cycling forces, they end up at one point here. That's the basic idea between those two cycling forces. You have to have two primary forces, which are going to cycle these two forms of substance from their expanded form back to their most compressed form.
Well, when you say both entities are overlapped in the Big Crunch, how do you envision that?
Since they're in different dimensions, they simply occupy the same space.